Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, colleagues and participants to this side event panel debate. My name is Hernan Manson. I work for the International Trade Center, and it's a pleasure to be in partnership with the European Commission organizing this very important meeting today. We are gathered here today to discuss and hear, particularly from the private sector, the perspectives on or in relation to the legislative effort that the European Commission has started with regards to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. We have approximately 100 participants joining now. We will essentially start with the meeting in a couple of minutes. So thank you all for those who have joined. It is also a pleasure for me to introduce this esteemed number of panelists. They come from different constituencies in the private sector. We will give them the chance to introduce themselves and where they come from. But essentially, we have tried to bring diversity into the panel and the insights. We have business associations. We have entrepreneurs who are coming from the textile and apparel sectors. We have entrepreneurs who are coming from the automotive industry, from the farmer and farmer organizations industry, and of course, from the coffee and food industry. Now, let me start by introducing our opening remarks keynote panelists. Mrs. Cécile Diot, pleasure. Thank you for being here. You're co-organizing this meeting. You're the head of unit for INPA for private sector and trade. Cécile, if you kindly share your opening remarks with us, you're welcome again.
Thank you very much, Anand, and good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here for this Fireside with private sector on this very important topic. If we look a little bit up on this topic, I mean, today we are ending, let's hope, soon the COVID period, and we have really an agenda of recovery and a kind of very much focus on building back better. Building back better means also sustainability, green and social. It means building back differently. And I think we have a role to think in this term, both as policymaker, but also as private companies to start to make it, to make a business more sustainable also, and to be more, I would say, resilient to shocks and to crisis. I was really happy to read yesterday in Financial Times that if you look at the flows of ESG funds, so basically environmental, social and governance funds, the funds have almost, I was looking at the figures, they have almost tripled since the beginning of the, from the European flows, since the beginning of the COVID crisis. So it shows that, I mean, on the financial market, they are reacting and they are believing also that we have to build back better in a more sustainable way. So I think this is bringing us today to the topic of today, which is really much more on the sort of due diligence, mandatory practice that we can sort of lead the way as European and get into the whole world for, I mean, at least for European company, for the global supply chains. So it means basically moving towards due diligence. We will have in a mandatory way. The Commission is now, as you may know, reflecting and planning internally to adopt a proposal which will come after the summer on a mandatory due diligence rules. And we see it very much as a game changer, because it will mean that it will create really a systematic also change and sort of also very much signal that we take responsible social business conduct seriously. And this is also something that we know we do it as, so of course, the European Commission and a public stakeholder, but we need to do that together with all stakeholders, and we need to have the private sector on board. And that's why it's very important to have this meeting today, to listen to where you are, what you have to say, and to really hear how to make the best out of this upcoming legislation. And especially from our DG INPA, International Development point of view, of course, we are more looking into producing country, I mean the more partner countries in developing world, which are often part of the supply chain and supply material, very important for EU company, and which maybe see on their side additional compliance requirements or see it as a burden. And we have to be careful that it doesn't create an unintended consequence with legislation, meaning that you have maybe EU business would disengage from certain country because the risk in terms of labor environment standards is seen as too high. And this we should avoid that this take place, because basically this would also injure the development of this country and not go along the same objective as we're trying to pursue with international cooperation. So rather than going out of this country, we really want to have accompanying measure to accompany this country, to explain what the compliance requirements are, how to make them happen in practice, how to work together with EU business, how to develop pragmatic tools so that they can move forward and ahead into more sustainable business practices. And this is something that is easy to say. It's not so easy to do in reality. And you have, we are aware of the complexity in the sectors, in the different size of company, in the global supply chains. And this is something that we are conscious we need to reflect together and to put really efforts to do that now as the new legislation will come into place, and as we really want this legislation to have impact. And to have impact, it needs to be implemented properly and well thought in advance. So that's why we had an internal workshop with ITC this morning, and we will continue tomorrow. But this is now the chance to listen to also the business perspective, to see where you are, what you would see as need, what are your problem, how we can better work together, and hear about the ideas. So I'm very much looking forward to hear the debate and to take part in this debate today with so many very good speakers and participants, so that we can all share expertise and try to make our accompanying measure the most fitted to the need. So thanks a lot, Anand.
Thank you, Cecile, for your opening remarks and for emphasizing the importance of bringing the development dimension into all of this, or not forgetting it. May I now hand over to Dr. Anders Aero. Anders is the Director for the Division of Enterprises and Institutions in ITC. Anders, welcome. Thank you for being here, and over to you for opening remarks.
So thank you, Hanan, and good afternoon to all of you, panel members, colleagues from the EU, OECD, ILO, FAO, UNECE, the private sector and civil society, and from ITC. So ladies and gentlemen, as Hanan said, it's correct, I'm a director of ITC, responsible for this topic of sustainability and inclusiveness, production and trade. And I'm so pleased to join you today for the opening of what I'm sure will be a stimulating fireside panel debate with private sector associations with regards to human rights and environmental due diligence in supply chains. The European Commission is drafting a legislation on sustainable corporate governance that will include an obligation for EU companies to perform mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence on their supply chain partners. The significance of this move is hard to overstate, since it has the potential to effect systemic change in responsible business conduct that would improve livelihoods, working conditions, and respect for human rights and the environment in producer countries, if done right. The EUDD for International Partnerships and ITC teamed up to organize an expert workshop to co-create ideas, tools, and support measures to complement the upcoming EU legislation and to further inform the brainstorming on associate measures for this process. The momentum towards mandatory human rights due diligence has been gathering pace in international forum over the last decade, as policymakers responded to the concerns of civil society, consumer, businesses, and trade unions. A key challenge of the new EU legislation and similar legislation is to find practical and meaningful ways to identify and manage human rights and environmental risks in global supply chains. It is in this light that colleagues from the EU, ITC, and other international organizations have been engaged in an international agency expert workshop today, which they will continue tomorrow, with the view of conceptualizing the impact and type of support required. Accompanying measures of support and guidance will be needed to incentivize, facilitate, and inform the meaningful engagement of EU companies with suppliers in developing countries. Suppliers will, in turn, require technology, training, and finance to enable them to adopt sustainable production practices. The EU, the development community, governments, the private sector, and civil society have an important role to play in this regard. For this reason, it is my pleasure to open this fireside panel debate to listen to the private sector and for colleagues from the EU, ITC, and the international organizations participating in the expert workshop to factor these views into their deliberations. It is my pleasure to see that panelists present include representatives from different functions and stages of the value chain, covering farmer associations, MSMEs, business associations, and consumer-facing multinational companies. Consumers are increasingly interested in how the products they consume are produced and by whom and under which conditions. One of the elements discussed this morning during the expert workshop was that the movement towards mandatory due diligence is responding to the limitations of private voluntary initiatives to manage human rights and environmental risks in global supply chains. Despite 2 decades of efforts by those voluntary initiatives, issues such as child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, gender-based violence, and living wages remain as pressing as ever. Climate change is accelerating, and supply chain actors are, in many instances, falling behind in meeting their commitments to net zero emissions. This poses a stark question: what will it take to make global and regional supply chains socially and environmentally sustainable? Mandatory due diligence and extended legal liability, combined with increased transparency and accountability, will certainly help. But the elaboration of sustainable supply chains will require an agreement between all supply chain actors, policymakers, and support institutions on what to address and how best to share the responsibility for their actions and the outcomes. Imposing mandatory corporate due diligence for exports to the EU may lead to unintended consequences in producer countries. An inability to comply with the related standards might mean that big brands will choose to disengage with SME suppliers or smallholder farmers due to the costs associated with due diligence and risk linked to non-compliance. The key here is not to lower the standards, but to build the capacity of the SMEs and small farmers to be able to meet the standards by providing access to market information and capacity building and related finance to enhance quality and production. Inclusive participatory agreements can be one of the associated measures. Most importantly, these agreements could cover the shared responsibility that is so vital to progress. SMEs must be at the core of building back better or building forward better. SMEs constitute an important part of the fabric for economic growth and income generation in developing countries. They employ a significant number of women and youth and are part of global value chains by exporting directly or indirectly through larger companies. Capacity building and partnership with SMEs will therefore need to form part of the main focus of any mandatory human rights due diligence and related accompanying measures. If done properly, this will not only lead to more inclusive and sustainable implementation of these due diligence measures, but also to better economic growth and welfare for all. Economic growth and the welfare of our planet must be approached in tandem. ITC strongly believes in supporting good trade, which not only creates positive and inclusive economic, social, and environmental impacts, but also provides entrepreneurial opportunities, particularly for women, young people, and poor communities. We believe that trade, along with the right set of policies, can play a catalytic role in transferring knowledge and technologies to tackle effects of climate change and contribute to low carbon and nature positive economic development that's also inclusive. In this regard, it is key that EU trade and international partnerships policies can equally provide the support to developing countries and the MSMEs in particular to realize the advantages of becoming more environmentally sustainable. I thank you for your attention and wish you all an inspiring fireside debate.
Thank you, Anders, for those words, the opening remarks. And a key point to highlight is the need to share responsibilities and to work together. And I think this is the nature of the panel debate we are organizing now. It is about bringing different types of stakeholders together with a focus on private sector. And this is now in relation to our panel debate and hearing the different voices that are present here today. For those of you who are joining as attendees, we have 110 currently online. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest in being here. Please feel free to put any questions, comments in the chat button, and essentially we will be picking on this and relaying to the panelists as you are commenting that. I would also like to take the opportunity to introduce Mr. Matthias Altman. He's the Program Officer at European Commission INPA, Development Cooperation. He is co-facilitating and co-organizing this workshop together with ITC, with myself, and with Mr. Oret, who is part of our expert and sustainability team. Oret, Matthias, and myself will be moderating the debate, and we will be introducing each of the panelists in due course. Without any further, let me now pass the word to Mrs. Marique de Peña. Marique, you are the director of Banelino. Banelino is a farmer cooperative, around 250 smallholder farmers. You also represent CLAC, which is an umbrella association and federation of farmer organizations in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, 400,000 plus members. And we're very keen in listening to you. Why is this topic of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence important to you? And share a bit more about your views on this. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Henan. As already said, I'm a manager of a banana cooperative in the Dominican Republic and part of the Latin America and Caribbean network of small farmers and workers that are active in fair trade. And we represent over 1,000 organizations, not 400, over 1,000 already in Latin America and the Caribbean. Why it's important? Well, the reason why many farmers organizations have organized themselves in cooperatives and in networks is because our mission is to create decent livelihoods for vulnerable people in rural areas, and making sure their voices are heard and their rights are respected. And human and environmental rights are very much part of those rights that not always are respected in global supply chain. So this is why we welcome very much the mandatory regulations that are on the way in the European Union, in part of their members, but also in countries outside the European Unions. We welcome it, but as already have been said, it needs to be well done. So it really would have a positive impact on many violations that we see in global supply chains, not just today, but over more than decades. And these violations don't have an easy fix. So if we want to build this system, it's not just on knowing about the violation, but also on acting on it. What are our main worries? One of the worries is that the current approach seems to be still quite top-down, although it's talking about meaningful participation of right holders. It is an initiative taken up by companies doing their due diligence in their supply chains, but many times where we feel the violations in our daily lives, the people that are involved or affected by it are best in place to identify those risks, the scale of the risk, but also support and build sustainable solutions for it. Remediation is key. It's not easy. It's key, but it needs the active input and leadership of farmers and workers themselves, because any remediation need to be sustainable. Another worry is that if we don't do it well, and I expect we would do it well, is that responsibility of due diligence and acting on possible variation could be transferred to the bottom of supply chains instead of being taken up by the top. And this would have a negative impact instead of a positive impact, because the ones that are operating at the bottom, small farmers and workers, are the ones heavily impacted by climate change, heavily impacted by COVID, heavily impacted by low prices, with almost no bargaining power, and with increasing social and environmental demands not always linked to sustainable prices. Another worry is that it needs to be built in a way that a long-term commitment is guaranteed in trade, but also in co-investment to build the needed capacity and act on violations. And finally, one of our worries is that companies could walk away from those countries with higher risk, less developed, poorer than other countries, and go to those countries where risks are definitely lower, which would have the impact we don't want to have, because we won't really offer solutions for the countries where solutions are most needed. So any mandatory human and environmental due diligence and acting on risk need to address definitely unfair trading practices, payment below the cost of productions to farmers, and also living income and living wage should be considered a human rights on itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Marike, for this, and also for sticking to the time. Very interesting indeed. Oded, over to you.
Thank you, Hernan. It's my pleasure to introduce Bekir Aslaner, who has a rather unique career because he's one of the few people who's worked in both the public and the private sector. He started his career in the Ministry of Trade. He has served abroad in a number of key markets, including China. And he then went to a parastatal export promotion agency. In the textile and apparel sector, helping to apply many of the trade policies and frameworks which he had developed as a public official. And from there, he moved fully into the private sector. As the deputy chair of a large textile manufacturing and exporting group in Istanbul. So he now is on the receiving end of those policies that he developed as a public official. And I guess this is only justice, right? That this is the universe completing the cycle. So Bekir, I hope you can give us some insights into what it's like in the middle of the supply chain, and how you plan to adapt and apply mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence.
Thank you, Aret, for your kind words. Hi, everyone from Istanbul. The new legislation, this is mandatory legislation, actually, for us is a new institution. We already, as a garment industry, especially after the Rana Plaza accident in Bangladesh, we are on the focus of the human rights and environmental due diligence. And we are surrounded mainly by the institutions of voluntary initiatives. We are complying with them. The buyers are asking us the audits and the other responsibilities, social responsibilities. But this new legislation, EU mandatory legislation, is going to introduce a new formal institution to the system. This will going to change some balances there, which is already established on the market. So I am approaching the subject from the institutional points of view, that when we face a new institution, which is mandatory, then what will change? These actually institutions are the systems. They compose of the parts, and the rules, rewards, penalties, assessments, and enforcement should work together to produce an output of human rights or environmental aspects, risks. Now we are getting a new set of rules, mandatory rules. What will it change? From our point of view, a manufacturer actor in the market, we can divide it into two: the absolute cost and the relative cost issue. The absolute cost, I should say that we are already accustomed to rules of the human rights, due diligence, environmental audits. So I am not expecting that this mandatory legislation is going to introduce a very new obligations. But what it is going to change, that all importers from all actors from EU side is going to ask it from all tires. And there may be an increase in the prices of the tires that we are factor prices that we already working with the audited subcontractors. But after this legislation, everybody is going to ask audits, everybody is going to ask due diligence, and lots of there is not enough subcontractors can comply to this one. So the prices may increase. But I would like to emphasize here that the problem with the absolute prices is the distribution of the cost along the supply chain. The main part of the cost is on the shoulders of the manufacturers now. This is because of the insufficient purchasing practices. We need proper purchasing practices which is distributed the absolute cost along the supply chain. Otherwise, we are not getting rewarded. The European Union, European Parliament's call regarding to introducing the free trade agreements into this system is very welcome. But I think that the purchasing practices should be supported by the trade policies more. Currently, the rewarding mechanisms in that means GSP based on the Form A is very old now. This is just say that is a least developing country can benefit from tax rewards, okay? But what about the human rights, and what about the environmental aspects, risk? How this system should reward them? So without rewarding these aspects, this cost, the absolute cost, it is not, I don't think that is an evenly distributed cost. So my expectation or my desire from the new legislation is to put more emphasis on the trade policies, which is going to distribute the absolute cost along the supply chain and reward the producers from the point of the human rights and the environmental achievements. The second issue, in my opinion, is the relative cost. Actually, as I said, as a garment manufacturer, we are all accustomed to the human rights audits, environmental audits. But what we are receiving, the problem is the relative cost. This is the cost between the pretending actors and the complying actors. Now, if a company is dedicated to pretend, with the current capacity of assessment system, it is very difficult to differentiate with the complying one, the pretending one. So the complying actors being more transparent and receiving more critics than the pretending ones. Actually, say dedicated to pretending, they are functioning very well. If I need to finish a product on time, I have to long working times. I am opening all my records, and I'm getting critics, and I'm getting the grade C instead of B or A. But the pretending ones, they are shipping, they are making loan. The current assessment capacity is not enough. So my desire from the new legislation, this EU, if it is mandatory, they should put emphasis on the assessment procedures. And I should mention that there exists already EU legislation on these assessment issues for product safety, for example. They introduce many detailed points there. Notified bodies, how the notified bodies act, how they certify. What about the assessment on human rights and the environmental? How can I appeal there? I don't know. So this is my expectation from the new legislation, that they should emphasize the assessment mechanisms, that which is differentiated compliant ones, complying actors, and the pretending actors. This relative cost is actually causing the reverse selection. So we cannot compete in that manner, which is we are really getting difficulties there. So with my time, I would like to emphasize these two issues. This is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bekir. It is my pleasure now to introduce Bettina Roth. She is working for VD Sport. She's responsible there as head of quality and CSR supply chain. I think you both have many things in common. You both represent mid-sized companies. You are both economically successful, but are also successful in your sustainability performance. And in case of VD Sport, I would say you really went through a very long process of supply chain transformation already and really arrived in the sustainability mainstream by now. VD is a company that is mainly active in the outdoor business or outdoor equipment. So textile is a large part of your supply chain. This is what you have in common, but I think you represent different positions in the supply chain, with VD being a consumer-facing company and trader. So I'm very excited you're here with us, Bettina, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and insights. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, indeed, we have a lot in common, Bekir and I, but I think some positions are slightly different. For those who do not know VD, we are a middle-sized company, but we are in an international competitive market. We are a family-owned business. We have around 550 employees, so we are a small fish in the pond. We have, our vision is that we want to be part of the solution and no longer part of the problem, which come along with our activities. So during the last century, we did a lot of voluntary activities. So we are facing high costs, that's the same like Bekir, and efforts to increase sustainability in our overall supply chain. So we had to build up expertise for sustainability, chemical and energy management, labor standards, and things like that. We hired and developed teams in Asia to support our suppliers to move with us on this way of sustainability. We set up a lot of guidelines and monitoring systems to really see the effectivity of our actions. And we established empowerment programs for our supply chain. We changed our way of doing business. So nowadays, we nominate our material suppliers. We know our material suppliers. We have long time partnerships with our supply chain. So a lot of our textile manufacturers, but also our material suppliers, we know for more than 20 years. So we build up a lot of trust and reliability. And we did, during the last years, we did a lot of extensive research for sustainable, innovative solutions. And we created our own label, our own sustainability label towards the end consumers, because we were missing a meta label that covered all that sustainability aspects in one single label. So there was a missing meta label. What we nowadays have with the green button in Germany, which comes now with this approach. And all of this costs a lot of money, and we also struggled with our situation in the market because we are a small family-owned business and our market share is not that big. So some of our suppliers are much bigger than we are. So how to convince them to change their way of doing business? And so we try to invest a lot in empowerment programs to really support from our side as a brand, to establish internal management systems to fulfill all that requirements which are coming up from different players in the market. And to cover all these additional costs, we constantly shorten our marketing budget, for example. And we work on our internal efficiency and how to reduce our internal costs. Nowadays, we are luckily seeing that we experience the shift that all these efforts we have done during the last years lead to new innovative solutions, like materials made from old car tires, materials made from castor oil, of wood-based fleece, to name only a few. And all of this makes us a valuable partner for our supply chain nowadays, even as a small family-owned company, and a desirable brand for end consumers. And a binding legislative would have the following advantages from our point of view. On the one hand side, yes, we are facing a lot of standards which our supply chain and we have to follow, but there are still missing standards in some other aspects. But if we are talking about standards, what comes along with the standard is the increase of collaborations in our industry and beyond our industry. We need more other brands, competitors, which are doing and demanding the same, because then we can reduce the efforts which are needed in our supply chain, because they provide the proper data. We do not have to do multiple audits and data management, because we are all working in the same way. So that might reduce the efforts in the supply chain. And we can share audits, we can learn from each other, we can build a platform where we can share best practices. That makes it much more easy for other brands to join us on that way, and for our suppliers to see that they can learn from each other. And yes, we also think that this mandatory due diligence can help to develop a feeling for the true costs, because so far it's very difficult even for the end consumer to understand why a sustainable product costs more than a common produced product. So we need to help the end consumer to understand what are the true costs behind products. And we hope that the new level playing field will help that that companies that avoid taking responsibilities have the competitive advantages on their side so far. So what we hope will come along with this mandatory due diligence will that we see more support to establish empowerment programs in our production countries, subsidies for brands and suppliers who want to switch, for example, to renewable energies or to establish resources efficient technologies. But also, I think we need financing programs for the development of sustainable management for small, medium-sized European companies, because we see in a lot of discussions that they are still afraid and do not know how to do the first steps on this way to more sustainability and corporate responsibility. And we hope, and that's my last point, that there are measures on the political level through interaction with other countries to adapt these legal frameworks and to help our supply chains in the different global supply chains. So that's our point from a small, medium-sized company. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. These are very relevant insights, and I think we will have a lot to learn and come back to that in the discussion later. It's now my pleasure to hand the word over to Stefan Kretz. Stefan Kretz is Executive Director of CSR Europe, the leading European business network for corporate sustainability and responsibility. And I would say these days, CSR Europe is also the busiest network in Europe, which works to bringing together companies and the public sector, discussing and collaborating on the mandatory due diligence and considering what type of accompanying support would be needed. So we are very happy to have you here, Stefan, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you for inviting me to this dialogue or fireside chat, you call it. I don't know all these modern things, but because I hear a lot of encouraging thinking that is a lot also in line with our thinking. So it's very interesting to hear. What I wanted to share is actually 3 observations and 2 consequences of it. By now I figured it out. So I'm the Executive Director of CSR Europe. We are a network of mainly large downstream companies, some business to business, some business to consumer, from all kinds of sectors, but large multinationals mainly. And they come together for learning and sharing and dialogue with the Commission and on all kinds of aspects of sustainability. But also we run, and I really want to talk from that experience, we run a number of collaborative platforms. And Bettina, you were mentioning that about best practice sharing and learning and sharing the compliance effort and the cost related to that, etc. Well, that's one of those that we run is in the automotive sector. So for 11 automotive companies is exactly that type of work we do. And it's mainly from that experience I will talk. They moved on now beyond also that compliance element and that due diligence element. They are still doing it. There are like 10,000s of plants that are assessed, etc. And they moved on, for example, on the agenda of raw materials, but also on a number of other issues. And it's one observation also that what I hear here as well, and especially when I was listening to Marieke, but also in previous work we did on this due diligence law, when we talk to non-governmental or civil society organizations who are doing work with people on the ground, be it with farmers, be it with cobalt miners, be it with in the platinum mines, wherever. If we talk to those NGOs or civil society, they have usually the same opinion as we have, which sometimes is not always the case in Brussels when you talk between NGOs and companies. But it is, and I think we issue maybe this week or we already issued, I don't know, a blog of Solidaridad exactly on that topic with the same issues, Marieke, that you mentioned, but it's from the practice, and that is my first point. We have to look at the law and the merits of the law from a practical impact point of view, not from a moral point of view, not from a pure legislative point of view. It's about what is the impact and change for people working in Turkey and SMEs in Turkey, farmers in Bolivia, whatever, rubber farmers in Central Asia, etc. It's that the starting point. So the first observation I wanted to make, and sometimes initiatives like Drive Sustainability, the automotive partnership is called, that's voluntary. And voluntary does not do enough, so we need a law. I never consider Drive Sustainability as a voluntary initiative. Drive Sustainability is somewhere where the car companies came together, also under pressure by their suppliers, saying, you are all asking the same thing, do it together. Make a cost-efficient compliance system. So it's not about voluntary against the law, because we are not against the law as such. There is merit in level playing field. There is merit in having clear expectations. There is merit in a standardized, you don't have to tell that to the automotive sector, in a standardized process. So it's not about voluntary against the law. That's my first observation. Second, please understand, lawmakers, that also a company is, and especially large companies, but maybe also smaller companies, are political arenas in their own right, meaning there are different tendencies, there are different power games going on in a company, and they also have limitations. We work in Drive Sustainability mainly with sustainability people inside the purchasing function of automotive companies. They have a lot of power in a certain way because they have the purchasing power. On the other hand, their power is also very limited because all they can do is buy parts. They cannot invest in large-scale improvement programs on cobalt mining in DRC. They cannot spend millions on that as such. So you have to see that political arena and these limitations of making change possible is a reality also even in big companies. And there is a risk with the law. And let me be a little bit provocative. Having a gold star, or I don't know, EcoVadis rating on your suppliers in your supply chain doesn't mean anything from an impact point of view necessarily, because the risk that you have been avoiding risky countries or risky regions or risky suppliers, and you say, no, we don't want to do business with them, puts people in misery, but you have your gold star. So due diligence is important, but it doesn't change as such the impact. And there the law puts maybe too much hope, and the Brussels debate, I think in general, puts too much hope on this due diligence element only. And a third observation I want to make is, it's maybe also a little bit provocative, our starting point should not be morality. The starting point is, but I said it in the beginning, it's what does it change in the life of people? How does a smallholder, how does a 500 people SME in Turkey or an automotive supplier in Adapazari in Turkey, I know the supply chain, how does their situation improve? How can they make better, well, less environmental impact, better social conditions? That is what is, how the right holders are affected. That should be our starting point, not the morality of respect for human rights in a way. So in that sense, we strongly believe, but we see the debate moving, and that's very good. The law as such is not enough. And the EU legislation should come together with a number of other things. And let me, Matthias, if I still may, two actions or approaches. One, but I heard it before, so I can be short, it's an investment and partnership agenda. That's the first thing. The money needs to be there. Don't think, if you want to make change, if you want to improve, let me stay in the automotive sector because I know it best, the artisanal mining of cobalt in DRC, well, you can count on a number of companies. You would hope you have development agencies. You would hope you have investors who want to invest in strengthening the supply, the value chain in DRC, that it's not only mining and smelting and then exporting through South Africa to China, but invest there. So it's in the first place, how are the financial, how to say that, the financial instruments created along that, be it from a development, I cannot say that, partnership perspective, or from a pure investment point of view. And and from a trade, I think Anders talked about the trade element. Second thing is, and make sure that that reaches the local people. Make sure that that reaches the local supply chain. Oriented to that, and we have the pleasure of having, or the opportunity given by GIZ, the German Development Agency, doing a very small pilot project on making sure that the local chambers of mines, so the local chamber of mines, not the NGOs or not the big companies, no, the chambers of mines in DRC, in Katanga, that they engage on creating sustainability networks, that they pick up by themselves. And the standard is maybe not there where it has to be, but if they create this virtuous circle of best practice sharing, everything what you were saying, learning together. And if someone in the chamber of mine wears the head sustainability, we think it might improve. So that is a partnership and investment agenda. And the last one is in Europe, we need to talk, someone said it before, about sharing responsibility. So we make, and we have a discussion document and a reflection document on our website on this topic, but create sector alliances. Let's discuss the challenges in the textile. And I think the Dutch have, I think, relatively good examples with their international business conduct alliances. I don't know exactly how they are called in English, but create sector alliance at European level, not to sit together and to see how good or how bad the companies are in their due diligence, but to sit together and say, where do we see issues in our supply chains? Who is trying to tackle them? How can we tackle that better? And how can we tackle that better together? That's why I wouldn't call it a sector dialogue like the German government was discussing, I think, but it's about sector alliances. Those who go out who do something. Me as a government, I can do something about it. Me as a downstream company with my value chain, I can do. Me as a development agency, I can do something. As an NGO, I can do something. Create that kind of alliance and orient it not on tick the box, but on what is the impact for people. And one last sentence, again on my provocative side, Europe needs to get its act together on this soon. And that's why it's not a moral thing. We see and we are involved and we see it and we also engage with them. China is moving with the CSR Alliance in Africa. There is a China-Africa CSR Alliance. It has another name, I don't know exactly. Well, at least with a different type of morality and a different type of understanding of the human rights and environmental agenda, but with a genuine one as well, I think, in a certain way. But they are taking action at scale. They are engaging together. Not we are doing Sweden, Germany, blah, 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 blah. Europe, there is. I wanted to end with that. I'm sorry, Matthias.
Thank you, Stefan, for the provocations and most importantly for the practical implications and how you're seeing this based on your membership and on what you observe. I would like to introduce Mrs. Nanda Bergstein, who is the Director of the Corporate Responsibility at the German coffee and consumer retailer Tchibo. Nanda, you are very transformational in your approach. You and your team are essentially supporting and making a fully sustainable business in Tchibo a reality. And we are also very lucky to have you here because you represent several sectors. So there is a coffee area, but there's also the consumer retailer, apparel and textiles area. Nanda, over to you. Thank you.
Hernan, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And also thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the Fireside chat today. And also thanks for introducing Tchibo already, which means I can leave out that bit. Maybe just two things which you need to know. We are also family-owned business. I think that gives us a little bit more freedom when it comes to the topic. I think that's important to know. And in terms of size, we're probably one of the, let's say, larger, medium-sized companies. Also, I think that's also important to understand where we stand. And as you said, we bring with a lot of experience over the past 15 years actually in driving human rights and sustainability in a whole number of global supply chains. And that's also the 15 years are actually also the reason why we have been so much in favor of mandatory due diligence law, because we've seen that there are barriers to creating impactful change in global supply chains if you're completely alone on that road. Luckily, there are a whole lot of companies like VD, for example, who are on this path together that helps. But ultimately, what we need is an absolute game change in the entire industry, in all sectors globally. And that means that companies have to step up together with regard to the responsibility for human rights and also collaborate on that. And I'll come to that in a second. So how I'm looking at the due diligence laws and combining measures or supporting measures is really from the question, how does that drive change and impact? And I think the first important point is that the existence of a due diligence law will take away the question whether companies are responsible for human rights or not. To be very honest, I think that's an incredibly important point, because very often that discussion is still pending. Is there a responsibility or is it not there? And I think that changes that discourse already. What we feel is important with regard to the law is really to ensure that it is applicable, and I'm speaking for a consumer-facing company, of course, applicable for us as consumer-facing companies, also from the raw material to the end product, from a perspective of making sure that we as companies and everyone else in the supply chain really take part of the responsibility. We shouldn't be creating incentives that delegate responsibility down the supply chain. I think that's an important bit. And I think I may also say that our experience shows that size is not so relevant when it comes to implementation of human rights and sustainability. We have wonderful, very small companies in our supply chains who do an amazing job on that. So I think it's more a matter of what instruments, what commitment, and these aspects which play a role, but not necessarily size, which is why we also feel every company, regardless of which size, should be part of should fall under the law, and also all market participants in Europe. That's incredibly important, as companies from countries outside of Europe are importing into the European Union and not necessarily fall under these rules. And I think it's important that that is included as well. I'd like to focus a bit on the question of impact and how can the law in a way help in terms of impact. Our recommendation is, please don't focus too much on liability, on personal liability. Why am I saying that? We are not scared of liability as a company, but we do know that the answer to liability is going to be a whole lot of auditing and monitoring. And everyone in this room has just said that the impact of that is not strong enough. So that's really, and I think from a company perspective, you know, we will want to protect ourselves, and that means a lot of them will go into rating stuff, into auditing, controlling, and these aspects, and that doesn't create change on the ground. And I'll talk about what changes on things on the ground in a second. I just want to mention 2 points just related to the law. Risk analysis. We are being approached by data analysts, by communication analysts, agencies. Everyone is trying now to sell services to us in terms of risk analyses. And I think the point I would like to make is, in the request to the European Union, is can we not create a joint risk analysis over sectors, over countries, and have that open source? I understand the political implications of that, but I think it would take away a lot of the time which individual companies are now spending on doing the risk analyses. And we have that data out there. And as I said, I know it's political, but it would put our efforts more into the supply chain and into changing things. And that also goes for too detailed reporting. Reporting and transparency is great, but at the end of the day, the question is what happens on the ground? To come to the point of what creates change on the ground, and this is just really our humble experiences out of the past 15 years, and I hope they have some meaning in this room. What we know is that ownership-oriented approaches are the most important approaches. Building ownership on the ground, empowerment and partnerships, and also co-creating solutions is imperative, is absolutely key. And that also balances out the supply chain if we also take a second step, which is equally important, and that is purchasing practices. As a company, we're also a member of Act on Living Wages, where we've designed kind of a scenario, what it looks like to have fair purchasing practices, and we're working on implementing them in our companies. And purchasing practices is an integral, fair purchasing practices is an integral part of the story, again, to balance up, actually to balance our power, if one could also say, in supply chain. And last but not least, I think a third lever of change is joint coalitions. I'd like to put to the table the example of the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety. It's legally mandatory. It's specific, related to a topic. It's related to work on the ground. It's inclusive with the unions. And I also want to make the point, the unions and civil society have to be at the table as well. It's enforceable, and it also has shared financing. And for us, these are all the factors which make up successful joint sustainability. I could share a lot more, but I think I will leave it at that. And I hope that we have a good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanda. Oret, over to you to introduce Richard.
Thank you, Hernan. So Richard is one of the people on this panel who has to do the doing. She's been working for the FLA for, I guess, close to 20 years now. And in this time, she's been tracing, she's been monitoring, she's been remediating, and she's been accounting on conditions within the supply chains. And as you might know, the FLA is one of the voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives which exists, but it's the only one which actually publishes its results, and where the audits which it conducts or the verifications which it conducts on the performance of its member companies actually are made public. And this was already a decision they took 15 years ago. It's been in place for quite a long time. And I think it's one of the examples of transparency that I hope Richard will talk about, and how this helps to move the dial in terms of conditions on the ground.
Thank you, Red, for that introduction, and really great to be part of this panel. So as Oret has already introduced a little bit about the FLA, we were set up as a due diligence organization. We independently verify companies' corporate responsibility and corporate behavior, and we publish reports on it. And as an organization who is called quote unquote voluntary, nothing in the FLA is voluntary, only the membership is voluntary. But as companies enter, they have to align their standards through international frameworks, they have to trace, they have to monitor, they have to work with stakeholders, and they have to remedy. So as I said, I think this whole notion of voluntary initiatives, the first recommendation to European Union would be to parse out, these initiatives into who is doing what, and which companies are part of different initiatives, because that's something very, very important. So, just few factors to parse out these initiatives. And I think the FLA is different from a structure and governance, where we have trade unions on our board, we have CSOs, universities, and companies. So the policy making is collective, standards based. So it's grounded in ILO standards in terms of workplace accountability, but also the soft laws out there, the UNGP and OECD guidelines. What is the process of independent validation and accountability framework? So many industry, and we are not an industry association. I think I would keep ourselves apart from an industry association, because there's an accountability framework. We measure companies on 74 KPIs at the corporate level and 200 plus KPIs at the workplace level. So we work in apparel, in footwear, in sporting goods, in agriculture. And as companies join in, so if I take an example of a company like Nestle, so when they joined in, we started working with them in hazelnuts and cocoa, now in recycling, coffee. When they joined in, they have the standard, of course, at the headquarter level. But when we started talking to them about hazelnuts in Turkey, they only knew their two suppliers. They had no visibility into how many farmers are producing for them. And they also knew the tonnage and the pricing. So the three components, the tier one suppliers, the tonnage, and pricing. And that was in 2012. When we started working with them as a company, we first said, you have to have traceability. You need to, and the role and responsibility should be your company's. So it led to working with them in having established traceability plans and traceability targets to the supply chain. Now, how they start working with their tier one suppliers, so they have to support them. They have to support them in training, capacity building, but also contractually, they have to support them that you're going to do this, but we will reward you with better volumes, or, you know, there's a cost to compliance. So I think companies have to be very, and I think a lot of panelists have talked about it. The next thing is mapping your issues. So, you know, you have all sorts of issues in your supply chain. You have child labor, forced labor, responsible recruitment issues, you know, but then what are your priority issues? I think as you go upstream, the issues become so complex in nature and so systemic in nature, you can't address all of them in one go. So companies have to prioritize to say, okay, child labor and forced labor is my top priority at the moment. And maybe I'll put the living wages in the next, you know, frame in a way, but not lose sight of it. So I think prioritization, transparency, working with suppliers and that supplier engagement, then looking at, you know, how can you support through purchasing practices, which is more volumes, you know, better prices even, is very, very important. And then mapping the issue. And I just want to reflect a little bit more on the monitoring. Even though we do validation and monitoring all the time, I think monitoring is a means to something. It's not the end in itself. So we really hope as an organization that this mandatory human rights due diligence doesn't increase businesses of all these monitoring agencies and auditing firms, because what else do we need to know, honestly, what we don't know? So I think the emphasis of it somehow should be more on the remedy part of it. So if you ask me, if we do a good enough monitoring of a supply chain, that monitoring results are valid for 3 to 4 years. Things don't change so rapidly. So rather than investing money time and again in multiple audits again and again, rather invest that money in the remedy part of it. So what FLA has also kind of turned corner around is, and I'm very glad to hear, I think a lot of the panelists have made this about collaboration and complementary collaboration. So I would think that a big KPI in the mandatory human rights due diligence would be this collaborative remediation. So currently, for example, the FLA, we identified systemic issues in a supply chain. We only have 2 to 3 member companies who are working, but then we are reaching out to other industry association, other companies to force those alliances and to work on remedy. So monitoring is one part of it, but I think a lot of focus should also be on the remedy part of it. So in terms of, you know, just what we try to achieve through is that we definitely welcome this mandatory human rights due diligence. They provide a legal framework, they provide clarity to the companies, create a level playing field, and transparency to investors. So the positive benefits of the mandatory human rights due diligence is quite obvious. But what we also think is that having the legality will not necessarily operationalize, you know, what is required. And hence complementary measures such as the FLA or multi-stakeholder initiatives, or a smart mix, as we say right now, is extremely important. So having this, so what the FLA, I think organizations like the FLA bring to the table is how to operationalize that mandatory human rights due diligence in day-to-day practices. And what have you learned from your mistakes or the monitoring, and how you focus on the right elements of the process itself. So in a way, I would say that this mandatory human rights due diligence is extremely important, because companies who have been in this space for 15, 20 years, like, you know, some of the companies on this panel, they know, they have learned, but I think this mandatory human rights will bring along other companies who have not been there. But they shouldn't make the same mistakes, and learn from the companies who are at this table right now to say, okay, what went wrong? Because when I hear things like, okay, we have to now start monitoring tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and we take the same program and apply to tier 2 and tier 2, I'm like, I mean, people must be out of their mind, because how do you have the resources to do it? And would you be ready to make the same mistakes that you already did? So in a way, I think, you know, if if we are going to do it, we have to do it correctly and really learn from the lessons learned. So last but not the least, my point is, I think a lot of organizations like the FLA are doing a lot of innovative work and testing proof of concepts on how do you collaborate, what are some of the techniques and methodologies working out there. So learning those, and the EU actually supporting those kind of innovative approaches to scale them up, bringing them from a pilot stage to a scalable stage would be something very welcome from an FLA's point of view.
Thank you, Richa, and thank you all for this first round. Indeed, very inspiring statements, a lot of convergence, and also some diverging points, but this is why we're here. I would like to start the session of interaction. Please, I see there's a lot of comments and questions in the chat. Oret and Matthias will be liaising to this and picking them up. But before that, I would like to address one point that Richa made in concluding. Monitoring is good, but remediation is better, right? And I think this intertwines and interweaves with many of the points that have been raised. Marike, you were talking about the producers and thinking on all of these implications, same as Bekir on the producer side. Stefan, you were saying it loud and clear, we need to be practical. It is about the people in the end, and how does this impact, not only from a moral point of view, that clearly is a priority, but from the business point of view, and most important, from the livelihoods point of view. Bettina, you spoke about the trust, and this is something I retained from your point. You have developed as an SME, you have invested your money, trust relationships with your suppliers, you have invested in these relationships, you have created learning, but most importantly, you have created sustainability that also results in markets and products that can be marketed and make you more competitive. Now, you would have not been able to do that whilst being more sustainable without this trust relationship. And I think I want to build on this. Stefan, you talked about these industry platforms or these sector platforms. Nanda, you also made comments on in relation to this, to the association and the platform work. And Marike, you are an association by definition. So how does this intertwine together? There is a key question, and now the question goes to Marike and anybody else who wants to comment on that. Being farmer or being a labor association, is it easy? Are you at the same level to generate these trust relationships with your consumer-facing partners? Can it work like this? Can these industry platforms work in a way? Do we need to innovate a bit more? What is your experience on this? And maybe we open the floor for the panel members with this whole idea of trust, and trust being the key element, not only in monitoring, but basically in the pathway to remediation.
You want me to respond, Hera? Okay. I think it's a very complicated topic, and I completely agree that we need to be practical about it and honest about it, because if we are not honest about it, it won't work. So having said that, I think, and I'm talking about the commodity supply chain, no? We have two kinds of realities, no? We have an economy of survival on the bottom of a supply chain, and an economy of maximizing profit at the top of a supply chain. That's a reality. And I'm happy that this debate is opening also a debate about true cost and true prices, but there is no debate on mandatory obligation towards paying these costs. So I think that is number one. So in this reality of survival and maximizing benefits, how much you want to know and how much you are committed to be part of the solution. I think that is key. And the fact then in how much you want to know, you can know it through audits, or you can build trust with the population that are affected by human and environmental rights violations in their daily life, and say, let's see and let's solve. If this trust relationship exists, that would be the perfect situation, the perfect. But in a supply chain where producers are trying to survive and companies are trying to maximize their benefits, how much real commitment we can generate to create this transparent and open dialogue and secure long-term trade relationship and investment in solutions. So that is, I think, one, to have this dialogue, there need to be trust and there need to be a commitment. On the other side, what I was very worried about is when I learned that let's fix or let's decide to take first child labor and then we go to living income. It's not one and another. You cannot sustainable remediate child labor if you don't tackle living income. So that I think it's the knowledge, because one of the root causes behind child labor is simply survival. Nobody will stop working if working is part of a survival process. So I think it's not one and another, even to decide on priorities. This is why I said top-down is not the right approach. We need to know what from the bottom, what comes first and what goes next. And definitely this is not an easy fix challenge. It cannot be only fixed by audits. It cannot be only fixed by standards. It needs partnership, it needs investment, it needs real commitment and being very practical. It will be a long-term process.
Thank you, Marike. Very clear. Does anybody want to comment on this? Maybe Matthias and then Nanda.
Well, if there are no comments on your question, I would like to add one which is related, because I learned from the different interventions that one issue is coming up all over again. And this is the question, do companies have all to do these audits on their own? Isn't it better, as Richard said, to invest that money into mitigation of risks? You, Nada, had this very interesting proposal of a joint risk analysis as an open source. So can we actually save money and time and perhaps also build trust by combining these steps that are required in the due diligence process? So this due diligence process actually is something companies, we may assume, have to do, in particularly under a mandatory framework. So the question is, what are the steps where companies have to remain responsible on their own and have to act on their own, but what can we perhaps actually achieve better through collaboration? There are things, I think, where companies alone may not just be the right actors to achieve, for example, of knowing what would be the right income or the right income and the right living wage that is necessary in a particular sector for a particular commodity. No company can establish that on its own. And if you then work in a country where you do not even have public legislation on minimum wages or something, then it's even harder. So this is just an area where collaboration is probably the best way for companies to figure out what is a living wage and how can these companies then agree on paying that living wage. So this, my question to you, and I don't want to address to any particular one of you, but where, as in particular the company representatives among you, where is the limit where you would say, yes, we can collaborate, and where you say, no, this has to stay within our company and we have to take responsibility for this on our own, because this is finally a competitive issue for you, where you do not see scope for sharing that with your competitors and work jointly on solutions.
Thank you, Matthias. I think Nanda, you had your hand up. Maybe you want to comment on Marike's question or comments, and also on Matthias, and then over to Stefan. Nanda, over to you.
Okay, I'll actually make a combination. The answer is a combination of the two issues which the two of you just raised. I think the one thing which companies should be focusing on very strongly is purchasing practices. And it's the most sticky issues for us as companies if we look at it individually. But if everyone has to do that, I think there's much more space and freedom to drive sustainable business practices in the supply chain. I think that's really the first most important step and the most difficult one. And then the question, what should still be within the own realm? I'm now brainstorming. From my perspective, all the rest can actually be done in a collaborative manner. The key point is, though, you can't, and I agree with, I think, what Marika said, you can't split up the topics or the layers of the supply chain. This only works if we understand supply chains as equal, and all partners in it are part of that dialogue on how to create solutions for change. That's the only way how it's going to work. It makes it much more complex, but if you do it once and properly, I think, and there's facilitation that can happen. We can have a conversation about that later on if you're interested. But I think that's what it's about at the end of the day.
Thank you, Nanda. Stefan?
Yeah, if I may, I think in this space, a lot is pre-competitive, actually, and especially the element of risk assessments, share better, and the proposal that was made related to that is interesting, and that's something we are trying to do in Drive Sustainability, where instead of doing each OEM their own risk, raw materials, risk profiles, well, at least we are doing it together, but at the same time, we see a lot of consultants bringing solutions. I think also the Commission made a very good work with the Joint Research Center on Materials Risk. So there's a lot around where then I think in those alliances that we have in the image, you can discuss that and align that and improve that and make it more efficient. The same for the due diligence process. We can standardize even more and better, and a law that says a standardized way of doing the due diligence would be helpful of that. It gives a lot of opportunity on cost saving, but it's not that cost saving that will make if we then can spend more money somewhere else, because the money needed to spend somewhere else is even from a different order. Now, one of the issues on due diligence that we see in Drive Sustainability, but we did for the German presidency a discussion, a paper on that, an analysis on that, where we looked at all these initiatives. They have a common set of guidelines, they have a common set of due diligence standards and assessment tools and whatever you want. But what was missing was sometimes how do those companies integrate them in their decision-making process. So that is something that is really, and we see that also in automotive, and not all the partners in Drive Sustainability act upon the information they get out of due diligence in a firm way. So, and I think one of the requirements we make is you need to include this in your purchasing practices, actually, and the decisions you take. And there is still individual company improvement necessary there. And then also the decision, what are you doing? How are you going to act? Some of the act in order to remedy a situation is individual by each company. In your value chain, what are you doing, especially then with your most strategic suppliers, in your most strategic countries, etc. But at the same time, a lot can be done collaborative. That then can be brought back to this alliance level. So I think there is a lot that can be shared that is pre-competitive, but there's still a burden and an obligation and a good management practice, I think, to integrate those sustainability considerations in your individual project decision. Project can be a new supplier, a new sourcing country, whatever, a new material that we are going to use. Do we look at sustainability? Maybe not enough. And there the law doesn't say much about that. So the OECD asks that as well, but it's much more difficult.
Thank you, Stefan. Over to Bettina, then we have Richa, and then we'll go back to Matthias, who will share some of the questions from the chat. So Bettina, over to you.
I agree to a lot of points which you mentioned, Stefan. I was really thinking about what should stay inside a company's decision or inside a company. And honestly speaking, I think it's only the decision how much and how deep a company wants to move into that wave towards more sustainability, because I think that's the big difference between the different kind of companies we have in Europe. There are smaller, there at the very, very beginning of this path. And there are others like us and Chibo already doing this job since more than 10 years. So there are differences. And I think it's that is still something that a company needs to decide for their organization size, for their level of knowledge inside a company. But all the other things, I think, can be done collaborative. We had a lot of discussions internally when we started to discuss about publishing our supply chain to make it public available. And there had been concerns internally and a lot of discussions. Do we lose our advantages to our competitors because we invest a lot of new innovative materials and we bear the cost, and then they come and buy the same materials from the same suppliers without this initial investments. But now we share our supply chain and the name of our partners and addresses in our sustainability report since 3 years, I think, or 4 years now. And we do not see that we have any negative effects from that. So sometimes internal discussion are they are really important, but we see that there are more positive impacts to share knowledge, to share data, to share results from findings from out of audits or complaints. So I think it's only really this decision: how much do I want to invest in human manpower, in how deep I want to start at the very beginning. That should be the final decision of a company, and stay inside the companies.
Thank you, Bettina. Richa?
Yeah, I would like to actually address 2 points. One is on the child labor and its root causes. And I totally agree with Mary Kay that, I'm not looking at it in isolation. I think the point what I was trying to drive at is if we start talking about living wage and living income as the first starting point, it's a no-go. We will be talking about it for 10 years and the dialogue will not go anywhere. We have talked to companies where companies said, I can change the prices today, but unless my competitor changes it, I will not change it. So we are in this dialogue for 20 years. But looking at child labor and looking at, we have also worked with producers who make all this money with vanilla, but still have child labor. So I think child labor is not a single living wage. It is not a single cause. I think when I talk about child labor and forced labor, no company can argue with it. So I think the starting point of getting companies starting on something, those 2 points, which we have seen are very successful. And I completely agree with you. Living income, living wage is a root cause, but that's not the starting dialogue. We have seen wall and we have seen multiple reasons where companies say, I'm not touching it unless my competitor is, rightly so or wrongly so, which is for you to determine. On the second point on whether companies, what role, how collective action should happen. I think I actually more and more believe that collective action should be the mandate, honestly, because unless you have, and in a way, when companies say, oh, I'll take only collective action, I'm part of the consortium and I'm not taking individual action. So collective action is the mandate, so is individual. It cannot be either or. We have to get rid of this mentality that we can achieve something collectively and not work individually. I think they really have to go hand in hand, where companies have to try their own thing individually, but also collectively. So I think this argument of, we are part of this initiative, we are part of this consortium, we are doing collective things, collective. So you can do things collectively. Advocacy is collective, item. Risk assessment is a collective. But if you have to innovate, sometimes individual companies have more resources, more willing supply chain partners where they can go ahead of the pack and then share the lessons learned. So I think there's a very good balance that companies need to have of both individual and collective actions. And they can parse out, okay, this is where we will work collectively and this is where, but it's not either or in my, in our experience at least.
Thank you, Richa. I would like to take a look at the chat from our audience, where we have quite some interesting statements. And one actually relates to fair purchasing practices from Gerd van der Biddel from Solidaridad, that both Nanda, you and Stefan, you mentioned it. And the question is why these fair purchasing practices, or how can they be translated into practical and workable requirements that can be introduced in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence? This is perhaps a question to the European Commission, actually. How can we make our proposal in such a way that it addresses fair purchasing practices? But my question maybe to you is, what advice would you give us? How can this actually be incentivized through a mandatory due diligence legislation? Is there any volunteer wanting to take this point? Nada, please.
Yes, I think the question of incentivization is also a question for the European Commission, to be very honest. But it starts a little bit with the question, what are fair purchasing practices? And they're just a very concrete tip from our perspective would be really have a look at the guidelines, both from Better Buying as well as from the actual living wage initiative, where we've designed what elements are part of fair purchasing practices. I think that's a starting point, and then maybe having a couple of conversations with the experts who also design that, which is be a very practical tip from my side. And I just want, if I may, I would just like to say something about the living wage, living income issue that Rita just mentioned, because I agree with you. Of course, it's good to start with the topics which are easier to take in. But on the other hand, the living wage, living income debate or topic has been pervasive for over 20 years or 30 decades. And the reason why we have been lobbying also for mandatory human rights due diligence is actually because we have a collective initiative that is Act on Living Wage in the textile and garment industry that provides a solid solution on how to increase wages, but not enough companies. It's only 20 global companies who are part of it, but we need the a large part of the industry to be part of it so that the producing countries are willing to support, to jointly go into this process. So I think that is where mandatory due diligence law plays an important role to set up criteria for good collective initiatives, which have to be mandatory, and to drive change through that also. And I'm fully with you, by the way, individual efforts are important for that as well, it's no question.
If I may perhaps add one thing which from the European Commission side is important to mention, because both the question on living wages and how the mandatory due diligence legislation can actually promote and incentivize payment of living wages, or the question how can a law actually stimulate better and more fair purchasing practices. This is difficult to actually integrate that in the law and the proposal that we are preparing, because this mandatory due diligence is really a framework that says what should be done, but it does not say how should it be done. So it says, watch out for your human rights issues in your supply chain. And then you have several ways as a company to actually do that. And one strategy to do that is, and the strategy to mitigate these human rights risks is actually fairer purchasing practices or paying living wages. If you do that, you immediately get rid of many of your human rights problems that you may otherwise potentially incur, like child labor, for example. So there, the law may probably not give much guidance. And that again brings us to the importance of accompanying this law with guidance through other sources, through accompanying support, which is what we actually aim with this event today, but also with the workshop which goes next to to it to develop more, because we know the law will not fulfill this promise to give enough guidance to companies on the how to achieve mandatory due diligence. It will only say you have to do it, but how you do it, and if you do it in a way that benefits producers on the ground, that is decided by the companies. And there is where we think we can help with accompanying support and guidance, and this is what we are going to develop. So again, back to the audience and our distinguished panel, any further advice and recommendations on how to do best is very welcome. Thank you.
Marike, you have your hand up, and then Stefan.
Yes, I think there are opportunities in the European Union beyond HRDD, and one is the work on new regulations with regards to unfair trading practices. That I think are both work streams need to be better linked because one has a negative impact on the other or could have a positive impact on the other. No, and what I've seen in the unfair trading practices, the consultation was more in Europe, but some of us were able to give us input from suppliers to Europe, but there is no mention about payment of sustainable prices. And I think it need to be an unfair trading practice is paying below the cost of sustainable production. And because this is the root cause behind human and environmental violations. Now, so I think in some way it needs to be taken up, and maybe there we can do some collective analysis about what sustainable pricing means and what would be the minimum level that need to be covered. And also within the debate on living income, I feel we need to do a little bit more work. I agree that we have now 3 decades talking about this, which on itself is a shame, because for me it's a human rights that everybody should have wherever we live in the world, no? But we have quite some clearness about living wages because we are working very hard about it, and we get benchmarking and there are coalitions around it. But with regards to living income, I believe it's even more complicated because you cannot say to a farmer, you should have a living wage, because farmers have its wage is not good enough, because if we are hit by climate change, we need to rebuild the farm and we need to maintain our family while rebuilding the farm. We have COVID coming in. We have other kinds of crises, pandemics, more requirements. So I think we need to have a more global debate on living income. And if we don't do it, and I don't think we can talk about it for another 3 decades, because we already see that families are stepping out of farming. So we are in a need to get faster actions, and the European Union has taken up very important issues, and I hope we will be consistent so that one law will support the other law.
Thank you, Marike. Very important points. There's no compromise there. Stefan, over to you.
Yes, if I can add briefly to that, I think what Matthias outlines is indeed a challenge, and I would not even try to put it in a law either about fair wage and fair purchasing practices. Also because I would believe it's a little bit sector specific as well in how you deal with that. And let me give you an example from an issue in Europe. We have a project that is a platform also that is called Responsible Trucking, which is about the living conditions of truck drivers on European roads. So not something we have issued. There are a lot of issues for those truck drivers, human rights and social issues as well. And of course, one of the topics there is, and difficult topics, is the wages, the contracting, the subcontracting, etc. And we are at the table with shippers and carriers, and we are moving forward in that agenda on, and it's in a closed room, and that's also important because we discuss elements that make elements of competitiveness or that drive or not drive or something drive competitiveness. But so it's very specific for that sector, also in the way that shipping, especially truck driving, is sourced Sometimes, especially in automotive, it's just in time. In other businesses, it's a little bit different. So I think all those elements like fair purchasing, living income, but also what are good improvement actions, what is capacity building, that you should put in those sector alliances. Let the companies, civil society, governments decide, evaluate all the actions each of the stakeholders is doing, because it's not only company actions that will make the difference, but each of the stakeholders is doing, evaluate them, and there is a good place, I think. So you could say, as a measure next to the law, we would expect those sector alliances to deal with A, B, C, D, E. And then, because now I hear all this talk about what is criteria for good voluntary initiatives. No, what are the criteria for a good sector alliance? Because it's a shared responsibility. And that the European Commission could make. It should be, for example, it should have, the sector alliance has as an assignment to deal with and tackle the issue of fair pricing or living income by X time. And you can discuss how much time. But then it becomes very practical and pragmatic linked to your sector. So I would put a lot of those how to do as assignments in those sector alliances.
Thank you, Stefan, for that. Absolutely, and there is a comment by Nanda as well in the chat. Essentially, no one private sector can do it alone. It's not just about one company or one private sector alliance. Even at the sector level, there is a very strong need for the legislators, as we are seeing in this case, the local institutions, the support institutions and associations, and of course, this whole idea of the partnership. It also links to one point. You talked about this, Stefan, the finance and investment being critical component of the partnerships. The question of who pays, who invests, right? And the question of sharing this. On the value chain point of view, the different operators from farmer or from a supplier, tier 1, tier 2, all the way down to consumer facing, but of course, the public sector, the policymakers and the institutions. So these are the points that need to be factored when we are looking at the practical elements to again go back to the language used in this panel. The pre-competitive nature is the other key element that we want to highlight at this stage. If there is public sector money being invested in accompanying or in supporting, or if there is a United Nations support or other institutions or public sector government support into this, then of course there is a direct component for the businesses and the companies, but there should be a benefit that goes beyond the company's value chain or the territory in which they are operating. And I think this pre-competitive nature of what you can share, how others can take it as a case to replicate or learn about it is critical. And I really want to congratulate Bettina on this, because she's an SME. She's not the biggest multinational. You said it yourself. I'm the smallest fish on the pond in a joking way, but this is really outstanding, how you are able to share and how others are able to benefit. So this pre-competitive nature is also a key point. Now, we have 15 minutes left. What I would like to do is very briefly audit for some remarks. And then in the meantime, I will warn the panelists. We will be asking you for your final statements. If you can, essentially, when you're closing, think about and recommend to us, to first the European Union and Commission about the law. What are the things they need to bear in mind in relation to accompanying measures, but also to United Nations. And we have a lot of colleagues here in this chat today and conversation on the UN side of things. So if you can think about this, then we will have each one of you panel members to give a 2-minute closing remark. Recommendations for EU, recommendations for United Nations on how we can support and how we can accompany this law. But Oret, over to you while the panelists finalize their thinking on this.
Hernan, there's a question which was posted by Sandra Catalina in the Q&A, where she asks, specifically Marika, but I think it applies to all of the panelists, exactly how do you ensure in practice that small producers can actually access the assistance that would help them absorb the costs of adaptation to this new mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence system. And I think that goes to what the points you were just making. Stefan emphasized a lot the collective functions at the top of the chain, if you like, amongst lead companies. Can we also create some kind of systems for collectivizing and sharing these costs and benefits at the local level? And who actually does that? Companies are in a competitive relationship. Lead companies and their suppliers are at the end of the day competitors, and it might be difficult for them to share sensitive information about some of these questions, for example, child labor or something like that. So can we create safe spaces for collaboration at local level, and can those be a link through which these support measures and accompanying measures can be accessed?
Thank you, Oret, and the panel members are welcome to consider that also in their closing remarks. I will start on the reverse order, and that's only fair. So we will go from Richa all the way down or all the way up to Marike, so to say. Richa, over to you for closing remarks. What are your recommendations for European Union and Commission on the legislative effort, and also for United Nations and the EU on the accompanying measures?
I'll say this again. I think the role of initiatives like the FLA is important. And I would say that we believe that the government should consider a way to recognize companies who are taking that extra steps to successfully implement a human rights framework, whether it's Fair Labor Association, whether it's Fair Bear Foundation. Companies who have been in this journey should get that point. So providing that recognition or credit, for example, to have gone through this rigorous process itself already, would kind of benefit, companies, motivate the companies to take more actions. So in this way, the mandatory human rights due diligence will not just be about enforcement against bad behavior, as I said before, but about rewarding good behavior and creating an environment where, companies who are paying fair wages, living income, and having good working conditions, they become the norm and they're rewarded. So shifting from legislating and enforcing bad behavior to actually crediting good behavior. And again, if a company has joined initiatives which are good, can they get the credit? Now, to the UN, I would definitely recommend that. I think if UN can come up with an idea to parse out the different initiatives, which is based on structure, standards, methods, activity, accountability, transparency, remedial, technical advocacy, that would be something that would be great, because I agree with you. I think when the FLA and the Fair Foundation we started, we were the first few MSIs to work on these issues. But since then, there's a whole plethora of organizations who range from consultancy service providers to accountability agencies, rating agencies who have come up. So I'm not saying that every single organization, is perfect, but at least if we have certain structure to it and say, okay, what is the governance? What is the structure? What are the key topics that they're talking about? So for example, FLA has banned, any company from sourcing from Xinjiang, which is a big statement for a very small organization like the FLA to have, but we have done it. Or every company should pay a living wage. That's also a bold statement, but companies have to do it. Then, how do we independently verify the transparency requirements? We are perhaps one of the only MSIs who publicly, publish reports. So can the EU use some of these reports, or UN, consider this in the framework of what good multi-stakeholder, these voluntary initiatives could look like? And finally, what are the key topics that we work on? So this is topical advocacy, whether it's living income, living wage, Xinjiang, what it may be. So I think if EU can come up with how to credit companies on good behavior and doing the right thing, And if the UN could come up with these, parameters to say, okay, I'm going to parse out the voluntary initiatives into different buckets. And if companies are part of this kind of, or this structure of initiative, that's when they get the credit. And that's where, EU and the UN could work together. So those would be my 2 recommendations.
Thank you, Richa. Nanda, over to you.
Thank you. So I already gave my comments regarding the legislation in my opening remarks, so I will leave that out here. But I would, something which struck me, what Richard just said, is doing the right thing. And what I find, I'm coming from a practitioner's perspective, of course, is that very often there are not the right solutions on the table. And we are thinking too simplistically about what solutions can be. And my recommendation, and I know this may sound a little bit dreamy, but please allow me that, is we've had a lot of great experience in developing innovative solutions through co-creation and facilitation. And what I feel, what we really need, both at a global level, but also at a sector level, in discussions, in cross-sectoral discussions, is a highly professional facilitation that helps us develop innovative solutions. And I would love a global unit for facilitation, where you have these professionals who can really do this. Because it's an art, I can tell you. This would be my idea and recommendation, which I just put into the mix.
Thank you, Nanda. Extremely useful. Stefan, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the last remark of Nanda speaks to me, because we sometimes refer to running drive sustainability as herding cats. And cows are easy to herd, but keeping the OEMs together and find innovative solutions on their common issues is like herding cats sometimes. I said already enough. I think one element is that I would like to add: how can the law cannot do that? How can the European Union create a facility that goes local, that doesn't discuss in Brussels, that does not discuss between 11 OEMs in drive sustainability in office in Brussels or in a Zoom meeting in I don't know where or on which, but how can we support? And that's, I refer to GIZ with this small pilot project now, which is about how do you make sure that local chambers of commerce, in this case mining, facilitate themselves, the local mines and the local suppliers. That is something there we should invest in, I think, because then, and if the mining is not yet totally sustainable, there are a lot of issues on that mine, and there is artisanal child labor spotted, yes, and make sure they can improve. That is the key question. So go locally would be my, and I think, if I may, because I really, it was one of the best events I ever attended. The OECD did last year, in 2019, when we still could travel, a stakeholder dialogue on cobalt, artisanal and large-scale mining of cobalt in DRC, in the Congo, not in Paris. And that was very rich, because there we talked with the cooperatives, we talked with the large-scale mines, the artisanal miners, we took downstream companies visiting around, and that creates engagement. And that is maybe the basis, Marike, also where trust can be created, because it's about meeting a human. Levinas would say that. I stop there. Go local. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Very clear. Bettina, over to you.
I can totally agree to my colleagues with their statements. So I want to point out from a point of a SMA and perhaps other companies which are at the very beginning and are afraid of this new due diligence law, what is coming up. I think what would really help to speed up in all that initiatives and activities would be to have more open sources, like we heard before with the risk analysis and with share of best practices or guidelines or things like that. I think it's really a mess for small companies which are just at the beginning of this path to identify and to find out what can be done and what are the best tools for my size of company, for my kind of business I'm doing. So collaboration platform, open sources, share of best practices, very detailed for the different sectors. I think this would be really, really helpful. And on the UN level, I think it's we need to put the production countries into the loop. We need the unions. We need the responsible persons at one table and need to decide how can we really change the game. So what is really needed to be done. And my last point, I also wrote it into the chat. What was not mentioned in all this discussion so far is the end consumer. And I think on the UN level and on the EU level, we should focus how can we sensitize the end consumers about the true costs and what's going on, because they are one of the big factors in this game-changing process. So I think we should focus on that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Bettina. Bekir, over to you. You are mute, Bekir.
Okay. Okay,
Yes.
now? Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to emphasize again the efficiency of the assessments. This new legislation should put real attention on the assessment capacities and the methodologies. And at the end of the day, due diligence is a flow of information. Now, the trusted information, the new emerging technologies, distributed ledgers, which may help to the specifically to the SMEs, should be taken into account and should be supported in a way, so that the fatigue of being assessed should be there should be some solutions around SLCP framework somewhere, which is supported with the distributed ledgers. I think it will help very much. And finally, I also mentioned that for the purchasing practices, the governments and the tax authorities should start to give something, okay? By rewarding these human rights and then environmental achievements of the companies. They should start it. Then the brands maybe and the buyers will follow them, and the manufacturers will get the benefit, and we will serve it to our workers. So the starting point should be from the tax point of view, the tax collectors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bekir. Marike, over to you.
Thank you. I think everything is said, but definitely the human rights, due diligence, and environmental rights need to address purchasing practices. Should come with a mandatory payment of true price and true costs, or should develop itself towards it. The other point, I think we need to take away a little bit the taboo about talking about human rights violations, and talking far more about root causes behind it. We can talk about child labor, or we can talk about the root causes behind the child labor, which would be far more open, transparent, and constructive, because child labor need a fix. We need to fix it fast, which is impossible. So if we would try to fix and respond to the root causes, finally, we will have the same outcome, no? Definitely, I believe we need to talk with the UN and the OECD to build a bottom-up approach, because we need to identify and develop responses with the impacted populations. Because the other way around, it won't be good enough. And I just want to end with an example about child labor. If we would say, well, we need to get the child off the farm, where would we leave the child while their parents are working? That is a simple question, because in our countries, we don't have any kindergarten or whatever you call it. So would the child be better off or worse off? So there are a lot of topics that we need to address beside living income and living wages to really build a proper response to the problems we face, and which end up with violations. And definitely this cannot be done without proper partnership between companies and the suppliers at the bottom, but also supporting our governments, because local authorities in many of our producing countries are having their own challenges with tackling human rights and need to be supported in being a partner with farmers and workers to solve the problems we face. So that would be, the main thing is we need to take off the taboo, get towards a constructive dialogue and build solutions.
Thank you, Marijke. We are approaching the end of this fireside chat. Let me thank you all panelists for your very helpful insights. We will work with them in our workshop that will continue tomorrow. We are really grateful for the multiple ideas that you shared, for the insights you gave, for the perspectives we gained from you. Let me also thank the audience which participated in the chat, which showed interest in this topic. I think this topic is indeed an important one at the moment. We have the opportunity with this move from voluntary to mandatory due diligence to really achieve systemic change in moving companies towards more responsible business conduct, but we also have the responsibility to do it right, to do the legislative work right, but also to do the accompanying support right, so that this does not have the unintended consequences that may indeed be there and that many of you have mentioned. So mentioning the audience, we have had almost 80 different countries represented. So even though this event was convened from Geneva and Brussels, we, at least thanks to our audience, have managed to bring it a little bit also to the local and to the field where we actually want to see all of this have the impact and have positive impact. So we will continue tomorrow in our workshop working on this topic, working hard on doing a good job in at ensuring that this legislative initiatives by the European Commission will have positive impact on the ground in the long term. And that is where you helped us to do a good job today with your comments, with your remarks, with your insights. Thank you all for that. And we look forward to stay in conversation with you in the future on this topic, which will probably concern us a long time from now. Thank you all and have a good afternoon and evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.